Okay, bagel bakers, let's make cinnamon raisin protein egg bagels with our wonderful personalized protein powder. That's how we get so much protein in our bagels. Now, a couple things before we start. If you've ever made bagels at home, you know, number one, that they're made with yeast, and we're not doing that. So if yeast recipes intimidate you, you don't need to worry because this is really easy. We're just using baking powder and baking soda. And the second thing is, if you've made bagels at home, you know that you boil them before you bake them. We're not going to do that either. So this is really a lot simpler. It's really a bread. It's shaped in a bagel shape. I think it's a pretty good approximation of a bagel. Anyway, it worked. I was surprised when I was developing this recipe that it came out as good as it did. So, and I hope you feel the same way if you try this at home. All right, so let's get started. The other thing I wanted to say about the flours in here is I'm using a blend of whole wheat flour and white flour. I tried doing this with 100% whole wheat, and to be honest, it was just a little too heavy for my taste. If you want to do that, it's fine. I figure I'm getting plenty of other whole grains the rest of the day. I can do a mixture and it's all good. All right, so we're going to start 2/3 of a cup. I'm using white whole wheat flour is what it's called. Sometimes it's called whole wheat pastry flour. And I'm using that because it's a little bit more finely milled, and so it seems to work better in this recipe. It's not quite as grainy as regular whole wheat flour. All right, then I'm adding a cup of just regular unbleached white flour, all-purpose flour. And then to get our protein, this was the part where I just took a deep breath and said, I'm going for it. And I put in 3/4 of a cup of PPP. That's 12 tablespoons. That's 60 grams of protein that I'm adding to the recipe just by doing that. And it works. I'm telling you, it works. It works. All right, and then we are adding a teaspoon of baking powder and a teaspoon of baking soda. So that's going to help our bagels to rise. I'm also putting in about a quarter of a teaspoon, don't put a quarter cup, a quarter teaspoon of salt. And then because I'm making these cinnamon raisin, I'm putting in 1.5 teaspoons of cinnamon. Now, if you want to just make plain egg bagels, you can just leave the cinnamon out. And then the other thing you probably wouldn't put in is the raisins. I'm using 1/3 of a cup. I decided to make raisin bagels, honestly, because they're my husband's favorite. I'm more of a plain bagel person, but he loves egg bagels, so I made these for him. All right, so we're going to stir up these dry ingredients, try not to get them flinging all over the counter there, just enough to kind of mix it up. And then we're going to now make the wet part of the dough, and we're going to mix them together. So to add a bunch more protein to our bagels, I'm going to use 6 eggs. Now this is going to give it that nice egg flavor. It's going to give a lot of protein because we've got a lot of protein in each egg. It's going to give it structure because any protein, when you take an egg from, you know how when you fry an egg at home and you take it from raw to cooked, it goes from being runny to being firm. And so the same thing happens when you bake with eggs, is it gives your baked goods some structure. So I've got 6 eggs here, and I'm going to separate one of them. Not separate them like that, but separate it. I've got too many bowls here. I'm going to separate it. I'm going to put the white of the egg in this little bowl here. And the reason I'm doing that is, and you'll see in a minute, is once our bagels are done, I'm going to brush them with the egg white. So egg white in here, egg yolk goes in there. And then to the egg white, I'm going to add 2 tablespoons of water. And you kind of want to do this before you get to making the bagels because you're going to see it makes a mess. No jewelry today because we're going to get into it and we're going to knead this dough. All right, so that's our egg whites. That's set aside. Here's our egg yolk. I'm going to put the other 5 eggs in here. And again, what we're doing by doing this is that each one of these is adding about 6 grams of protein. So we've got, 6 eggs in there. So that's another 36 on top of the, what was it, 60 or whatever we had from the PPP. And then, of course, there's traces of protein even in the flour. Whole grains, you kind of forget. We think of them as being mostly carbohydrate. Excuse me, but they also have protein in them as well. All right, I'm going to whisk these up. And the other thing that we're going to add, two things we're going to add to the liquid here, is 2 tablespoons. I'm using agave syrup. You can use honey if you want to. You can use maple syrup. Even if you're not making cinnamon raisin bagels, even if you're just making plain ones, a touch of sweetness does help. We're going to make 8 bagels, which means that each one is going to have less than a teaspoon of added sugar, which is minor. It's just a few grams, so don't sweat it, please. It's just a little bit. And then I'm going to use 1/3 of a cup of Greek-style non-fat yogurt. So what is the yogurt doing? I always like to throw a little food chemistry at you guys while we're making these things. So the yogurt is very acidic, right? And the baking powder and the baking soda that's in here are very neutral or basic. And if you've ever combined a base and an acid, you know what they do is there's a reaction and it causes things, it sort of bubbles up. So this is like an old style, by the way. You know, have you ever heard of like putting vinegar and baking soda, mixing it up and putting down your drain in your sink? If your kitchen sink is clogged and it bubbles up and it helps to kind of clear out your drain. Or if you ever made those vinegar and baking soda volcanoes when you were a kid. Anyway, it's a lot of fun to play with. But the idea is here is that what the yogurt and the combination with the baking soda and baking powder, it's going to help our bagels to rise and expand, and that's why we didn't have to use any yeast. All right, so that's mixed, and so what we're going to do now is just pour this on top of all of the dry ingredients that we had there. So our flours, our PPP, our salt, cinnamon, raisins, baking soda, baking powder, and so forth. And we're just going to stir this up into what's going to be a pretty soft and somewhat sticky dough. I will warn you in advance that it is a little bit sticky, and we're going to knead it, but not a lot. We're just going to knead it enough just to make sure that everything's holding together. And when you do that, you might need a little bit of extra flour. We're going to see. Everybody's flours are a little bit different. So it depends on what kind of flour you're getting from the grocery store. It depends sometimes on the weather. So today, for example, here in California, it's really hot and it's also really humid, which is kind of unusual for us. And so sometimes if you're baking on a day where it's humid, you don't have as much evaporation out of your dough, and so you end up with something that's a little sticky. This is pretty sticky, but not bad. I mean, this is about what I expected it to be. And so in order to get it into our bagel shapes, I'm going to pull my cutting board over here. I'm going to dust this with a little bit of flour. So you are going to need some, because if you don't, then your dough is going to stick to your cutting board, and that's no fun. All right, and then we're going to turn this out. And again, not a lot of kneading, so don't be afraid when I say kneading, because it's really just enough to make it into something kind of cohesive. And this is when it starts to get messy, but in a fun way. It's fun to get a little bit messy in the kitchen. All right, put that aside, and we'll sprinkle just a little bit more flour on top also. And all you really want to do is just kind of pull this together so that it's not super sticky and it just kind of holds together in a ball. You want to avoid the temptation to add a lot more. It's never going to look super smooth. We really just, as I said, just want enough to hold it together. This is not the neatest project by any means. I'm going to put a tiny bit more on here. As I said, it just depends. When I made these yesterday, I didn't need to add as much because it wasn't as humid yesterday. All right, but that's really pretty good. I mean, again, not extensive kneading. If you have ever made bread at home, you know that, sometimes they tell you have to knead it for 5 minutes. You definitely don't have to do that. All right, so I think that's pretty good. As I said, I've got this messy mess on my hands, but that's okay. I've got some water here to clean them off. All right, and now it comes time to shape them. Now, if you've made bagels before, one thing that you know is that you usually, well, there's two ways to do it. One way is you do it where you kind of shape your bagels into a rope, and then you turn the rope around into a circle and do it that way. Don't try that with this because the dough is really just too soft. So the easier way is to just shape the dough into a ball and kind of poke a hole in the middle, which we're going to do. So let me show you how we're going to do that. We're going to make 8 out of this. So that's 2, that's 4, and hopefully they'll be pretty even in terms of the amount of dough. If you're really obsessive about this, I guess you could put them on the scale. I'm not, but you could. And then what I like to do here is put a little flour on my hands just so it doesn't stick too much. And I just like to roll these in a ball. I know this looks like I'm using more flour than I need, but I'm not. All right, roll these into a ball. And then just flatten them a little bit like that. And then just stick your finger in the middle and then just start spinning it around. And it works really well, and you get this nice, good-sized hole in the middle. And the other thing I will tell you is every time I've made these, my goal is to get a nice big hole in the middle of the bagel, but they puff up a lot. And so they still tend to close up. So you can make your hole in your bagel pretty big. And then these are going to go on our baking sheet. All right, so we'll do a couple more, and then I'll show you what happens when they're all done. You don't need to watch me make all 8, unless you want to. But this really works perfectly. The dough, I will tell you, has a really nice texture to it. It's, as I said, it's soft. It's not sticky anymore. I had that little bit of extra flour that I had to add to it. But it's pretty easy to work with. Now, if you got to this point and you thought, oh, I just don't have time to finish, you could put this in the refrigerator if you needed to. Nothing would really happen to it. So you could do that, and then you could take it out later and bake it later. All right, so that's how we would do that. As I said, I'm not going to make you watch me do all 8 of them. But what I do want to show you is what happens at the end. Now, remember that we're making cinnamon raisin. And so we had the cinnamon in the dough, we had the raisins in the dough. And so all I'm doing is I'm just going to be brushing these with that egg white and water that we did together. If you decided that you wanted to just make a plain bagel, or you wanted to put some other seasonings on top of it, then what you would do is after you brush them with the egg white is you can put whatever you want on it. You could put, more classically on bagels is, sesame seeds or poppy seeds or some kind of a blend like what they call bagel seasoning, which is sesame seeds, usually poppy seeds, some onion. You could put herbs on it if you wanted to, if you want to kind of go that route. When you do this painting business with your egg white, just be sure you get all sides painted and covered. And what this is going to do is it's going to help give our bagels a kind of nice shiny appearance on the top after they're baked. All right, so pretend that the other 5 are on there. And then what happens is these now go into our preheated oven. Remember, we were at 450 degrees. It's really hot. But the nice thing is they only have to bake for about 13 minutes. They bake really, really fast. And I'm going to pull some out and show you what I did. So these are going to go in the oven. I'll be right back. And here are the bagels that I made earlier. All right, and they're pretty awesome, guys. I have to say, they came out really, really well. If you look at them, as I said, the holes did close up quite a bit. They got a lot bigger. They really do expand a lot when they're in the oven. But I will tell you, the aroma is great. I'm definitely picking up the cinnamon flavor. The texture is really good too, and I wanted to show you that because I took one and I sliced it in half and I toasted it. I happen to like my bagels toasted, but the texture is good. It's got a good bready texture. when I come back and I tell you about the nutrition information, you're going to be just kind of blown away by how much protein is in there, although some of you are probably already doing the math. But let me just show you real quick what I did. So I mean, you can do whatever you want. I think this would be really good with some nut butter on it, you know, like, especially since we've got the raisins and the cinnamon. So a nut butter, like an almond butter or peanut butter, would be really good. I just toasted it, and I just wanted you to see that it's, you know, it's just really nicely, it browned nicely. You can see the texture of the bagel is really, it's a really nice bready texture. And what I did here was I just toasted it, and even looking on the inside, the texture is great. And what I'm gonna have mine with, if you remember a couple of weeks ago, I made some jam, some mixed berry jam I made with aloe. Do you remember that? I did it with aloe and active fiber. It was really good, and I had some still in my refrigerator. I restrained myself and I didn't eat it all. So I'm putting a little bit of that on my bagel. I'm going to taste it. It's so good. I will tell you that the texture is great. It's you know, it's definitely got a nice bready texture, even though it's not a yeast bread. In my view, toasting it really adds something, because toasting adds a lot of flavor, but you don't necessarily have to do that at all. As I said, you could just split this open. If you made plain ones and you decided that you didn't want to use them, you know, do the cinnamon raisin, the other thing you could do is just use that plain bagel and use it in place of bread to make a really nice sandwich, high protein sandwich. So